The Hall of Voices was the largest structure ever built by any civilization in the known galaxy, and it hummed with the whispered conversations of 4,000 species who believed they had already seen everything the universe had to offer. Admiral Rhea Marine stood at the podium, reserved for Earth's delegation, which sat at the very back of the chamber, far from the golden thrones of the elder races, far from the light that bathed the powerful and the ancient in warmth and importance. She had come to ask for a permanent seat on the security chorus for the third time in 4 years, and for the third time in 4 years she already knew the answer before anyone spoke it. Humanity is still young, the Dranari High Speaker announced from his hovering platform, his 4 eyes blinking in a slow rhythm that his species used to express pity. Or was it amusement? Rhea could never quite tell the difference. Perhaps in another 1,000 years, when your species has matured beyond its aggressive tendencies, we will revisit this discussion. A ripple of agreement moved through the chamber like a wave across still water, and Rhea felt the familiar heat climb up the back of her neck, not anger exactly, but something close to it, something that tasted like iron and patience. Wearing thin, she gave a diplomatic nod, turned on her heel, and walked out of the Hall of Voices without another word, because she had learned long ago that arguing with 4,000 species who had already made up their minds was like screaming into the void between stars. Back in her quarters aboard the Terran Embassy Station orbiting Ethara Prime, she poured herself a drink and stared out the viewport at the endless field of alien ships drifting in formation around the capital world, elegant, ancient, beautiful vessels belonging to civilizations that had mastered faster-than-light travel while humanity was still figuring out how to make fire. 40 years, she muttered to herself, swirling the amber liquid in her glass. 40 years in this conquered, and they still look at us like children playing with weapons we don't understand. She set down the glass and pulled up her reports, trade agreements, border disputes, the usual bureaucratic noise of being the galaxy's youngest member, and was halfway through a particularly tedious document about shipping lane regulations when every alarm in the station screamed to life at once. The lights went red and a sound cut through the air that Rhea had never heard before, a sound that every species in the galaxy had been taught to fear, but none alive had ever actually witnessed. The wailing cascade of a Class Omega distress signal, the highest level of emergency the Conquered had ever established, reserved for extinction-level events. It was coming from the Valkyrie Expanse, a vast region on the far side of the galaxy, home to over 300 species, billions upon billions of living souls, spread across thousands of worlds, and every single one of them was screaming. At the same time, Rhea's hands moved fast across the console, pulling up data streams and intelligence feeds that were flooding in from every corner of the Conquered, and what she saw made her blood go cold in a way that no enemy fleet or political humiliation ever had. The Hollow had come. It was supposed to be a myth, a nightmare story that elder species told their young to keep them humble, a legend about a swarm intelligence from beyond the galaxy's edge that consumed entire star systems and converted organic life into raw fuel for its endless expansion. But the data pouring across Rhea's screen was not a legend, and the dying worlds burning in the expanse were not a story. She rushed back to the Hall of Voices and found chaos. 4,000 species were shouting over each other in languages that the translation systems could barely keep up with, and the golden thrones of the elder races were emptying one by one as ambassadors fled to contact their home worlds, not to organize a defense, not to send aid, but to pull their fleets back to their own borders and lock their doors against the dark. The Drenari High Speaker called for order and received none, and when he finally managed to silence the chamber long enough to propose a unified military response, the vote collapsed before it even began. The Lethani refused to send ships beyond their own sector. The Orvani claimed their fleet was needed for domestic stability, and a dozen other species offered thoughts and prayers and absolutely nothing else. Rhea watched the most powerful governing body in the galaxy tear itself apart in real time, watched civilizations that had existed for 100,000 years curl inward like frightened animals, and something shifted inside her, not rage, not frustration, but a cold and absolute clarity that settled over her like armor. She thought about Earth, about the small blue world that had clawed its way up from mud and blood and war after war after war, about a species that had never once in its entire history looked at impossible odds and decided that the smart thing to do was nothing. She thought about the Valkyrie people she had never met, whose languages she did not speak, whose world she had never visited, dying right now, right this second, while 4,000 ancient civilizations debated procedure. The distress signal pulsed again through the chamber, weaker now, and Rhea could hear individual voices buried in the static, parents calling for children, commanders calling for reinforcements that would never come, entire populations begging anyone, anything. Please, someone help us. She stepped away from the chaos, found a quiet corridor, and opened a private, quantum-encrypted channel that stretched across the galaxy to a facility buried deep beneath the surface of Mars. A facility that, as far as the conquered knew, did not exist. A voice answered on the other end, calm and waiting, as if it had been expecting this call for years. Rhea took a breath and spoke 5 words that would change the course of galactic history forever. Wake the Armada, we go. The channel closed, and somewhere in the cold red depths of Mars, lights began to turn on in the dark, row after row after row of them, stretching for hundreds of kilometers, illuminating the hulls of warships that the galaxy did not know existed, engines that had never fired, rumbling to life with a sound like thunder trapped underground. The galaxy had screamed for help, and humanity heard it. The shipyards beneath Mars had been built in silence over the course of 37 years, carved into the planet's hollow mantle by machines that worked without rest and engineers who worked without recognition. And when the order finally came to power them up, the sound that erupted from the red planet's core was felt on the surface as a tremor that cracked desert stone for 1,000 kilometers in every direction. Fleet Commander Aaron Vazik was sitting on the porch of his farmhouse on Kepler 22b when the summons arrived, watching the twin suns set over fields of engineered wheat that stretched to the horizon, and for a long moment he simply held the glowing transmission in his weathered hands and stared at it. He was 63 years old, retired for 9 of those years, and his body carried the scars of the colony, rebellions in the form of a synthetic left arm, a repaired spine, and a network of burned tissue across his ribs that ached when the weather shifted. But when he read the 5 words on the screen, something ancient and familiar stirred in his chest like an engine that had never truly gone cold. He kissed his wife, told her he would come home, and climbed aboard the transport that was already waiting in his field before the suns had finished setting. 48 hours later, he stood on the bridge of the TNS Defiance, the flagship of the United Terran Navy's first expeditionary Armada, and looked out at a sight that no human had ever seen and no alien had ever imagined. 14,000 warships filled the space around Mars in a formation so dense that from a distance they looked like a second asteroid belt, frigates quick and sharp as knives running in wolf pack clusters of 12, cruisers bristling with rail gun batteries and missile pods the size of city blocks, carrier ships hauling thousands of atmospheric fighters in their bellies, and at the center of it all the dreadnoughts, 47 of them each, one the size of a mountain range, each one carrying siege cannon capable of cracking a planet's crust wide open. The conquered had imposed strict arms limitations on humanity as a condition of membership. No than 200 military vessels, no weapons above Class 4. Yield. No development of planet-scale ordnance, and humanity had smiled at the treaty table and signed every document and shaken every appendage offered to them, and then gone home and built the most devastating military force the galaxy had ever seen in a whole. Inside Mars, it was not that humans were dishonest. Vasek thought as he reviewed the fleet readiness reports flooding his console. It was that humans understood something the elder species had forgotten in their 100,000 years of comfortable peace. The universe was not safe, had never been safe, and the only thing standing between civilization and the dark was the willingness to bare your teeth when the dark came knocking. Across the 12 colonies, the call went out, and the response was immediate and overwhelming in a way that made even Vasek's hardened heart swell. On Earth, reservists reported to mobilization centers within hours, pulling on uniforms that still fit, because they had never truly stopped training, and volunteers lined up by the millions at recruitment stations that ran out of forms before noon. On the industrial colony of Forge 7, factory lines that had been producing agricultural equipment pivoted to wartime manufacturing in a single shift. Change, workers staying at their stations for 36 hours straight to push out ammunition crates and armor plating and replacement reactor cores. On the orbital habitats above Jupiter, civilian transport captains donated their ships to be refitted as medical frigates and supply runners, asking only that someone make sure their families knew where they had gone. Vasek watched the fleet status board light up green ship after ship, reporting combat readiness, crew manifests filling faster than the system could process them, and he thought about what the Drenari High Speaker had said about humanity needing another 1,000 years to mature, and he wondered if the High Speaker had ever seen a species mobilize for war, not because it had been attacked, not because its territory was threatened, not because there was anything to gain, but simply because someone far away was suffering and no one else would go. The Chancellor of Earth broadcast a message that was transmitted on every human frequency. And because Admiral Marin made sure of it rebroadcast on every conquered channel in the galaxy. She stood behind a simple podium with the blue flag of Earth behind her. No grand stage, no dramatic lighting, just a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a voice that carried the weight of 8 billion people behind it. To the people of Earth and the 12 colonies, she began, tonight we send our sons and daughters into a war that is not ours, to defend people we have never met, in a part of the galaxy we have never visited, against an enemy that the rest of the galaxy is too afraid to face. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter but somehow stronger. They told us we were too young, too aggressive, too emotional to sit among the great civilizations of the conquered, and maybe they were right about the emotional part, because when we heard those distress signals, when we heard children crying and worlds burning, and 300 species begging for someone to help them, we could not sit still, we could not look away, and we could not do nothing. She looked directly into the camera, directly into the eyes of every human watching. We know what it means to be small, to be afraid and to be ignored, and that is exactly why we are going. The broadcast ended, and across human space something electric moved through the population like a current through water, not joy exactly, and not bloodlust, but something older and fiercer, a feeling that did not have a clean name in any language, but that every human recognized in their bones. The feeling of standing up when you have been told to sit down. On the colony world of New Carthage, war drums thundered through the streets as the garrison marched to their transports, and the civilians who lined the roads did not weep, they roared. On the Luna shipyards, engineers spray-painted messages on the hulls of warships as they launched from Earth. With love, and the cavalry has arrived. And you called, we came. In mosques and temples and churches, across a dozen worlds, people prayed not for victory, but for the souls of those who were about to fight, and for the strangers they were fighting to save. Commander Vazik stood on the bridge of the Defiance, watched the final status lights turn green, and opened a channel to the entire fleet. All ships, this is Fleet Commander Vazik, he said, and his voice was steady as stone. In a few minutes we are going to jump to the Valkyrie expanse, and when we get there we are going to find something terrible, something that has eaten worlds and broken civilizations that are older than our species, and we are going to fight it, not because we are brave, but because there are people dying who should not be dying, and no one else is coming. He paused for one heartbeat. Humanity does not look away. All ships engage hyperdrives on my mark. 14,000 ships powered their drives in unison, and the energy surge was so massive that it registered on sensor arrays across half the galaxy, causing conquered analysts on 100 worlds to stare at their screens in disbelief. A conquered intelligence officer on Ethera Prime watched the hyperspace signatures bloom across her display like a field of flowers made of light, and she turned to her superior with an expression that hovered somewhere between terror and awe. We told them they were too young to sit on the security chorus, she said quietly. I think they are about to overrule us. The Armada vanished into hyperspace, 14,000 points of light streaking across the sky of every human world simultaneously, and the children who saw it would remember it for the rest of their lives. The night the sky itself seemed to catch fire and race toward the stars. Humanity was coming, and the galaxy was about to learn why. You should never tell humans that. Someone needs help and then expect them to do nothing. The Armada dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Valkyrie expanse, and the first thing that hit them was the silence. Not the absence of sound. Space was always silent, but the absence of life. The absence of the thousands of communication signals and navigation beacons and civilian chatter that should have filled a region home to 300 species and billions of souls, replaced now by nothing but the low static hiss of burning worlds and the fading echoes of distress calls that no longer expected an answer. Commander Vazek stood on the bridge of the Defiance and looked through the main viewport at what remained of the expanse's outer systems, and what he saw carved something permanent into his memory that he knew would never leave him for as long as he lived. Entire planets had been stripped to bare rock, their atmospheres gone, their oceans drained, their surfaces scarred with the spiraling patterns of something that had fed on them the way a parasite feeds on a host, slowly, methodically, and without mercy. Drifting among the dead worlds were they shattered remains of alien war fleets, hundreds of ships from dozens of species cracked open and hollowed out. From the inside, their holes still glowing faintly with residual heat, and through the broken viewports of the nearest wreck, Vazek could see shapes moving in the dark interior, shapes that had once been crew members and were now something else entirely. All hands combat stations, Vazek said into the fleet channel, and his voice betrayed nothing of what he felt. Weapons free on my command. Formation. Spearhead all dreadnoughts to the front. Spearhead formation was a doctrine that no conquered species had ever used, because every military strategist in the galaxy considered it insane. It placed the heaviest and most valuable ships at the tip of the advance and drove them straight through the center of the enemy's strength like a blade, through flesh, absorbing punishment that would destroy a lesser fleet, while the faster ships behind exploited every gap the dreadnoughts carved open. It was reckless and it was brutal, and it was exactly the kind of tactic that a species with too much courage and not enough self-preservation instinct would develop, and it was about to meet the one enemy in the galaxy that it was perfectly designed to fight. The halo came at them like a living wall. Billions of drones poured out of the dead systems in a wave that blotted out the stars, semi-organic constructs the size of fighters, each one a fusion of stolen metal and converted flesh, each one driven by a fragment of the swarm intelligence that connected them all to the distant core like neurons in a brain, the size of a solar system. They moved with a coordination that was almost beautiful, flowing around obstacles and reforming after losses like water flowing around stones, and they hit the Armada's front line with a force that shook the dreadnoughts to their frames. Vazek watched the first wave crash against the Defiance's shields and felt the ship shudder beneath his boots. And then he gave the order that the Hollow had never heard from any species it had ever consumed. All ships advance, not hold position, not fall back to regroup, not form a defensive perimeter. Advance straight into the teeth of the swarm, guns blazing, engines at full burn, every ship driving forward as if retreat was a word that had been deleted from the human vocabulary. The dreadnoughts opened fire with their main batteries in the space ahead of. The Armada turned white with the fury of 10,000 railgun slugs and plasma lances, and missile salvos tearing into the swarm, and the hollow drones died by the millions, but millions more took their place, adapting, shifting their formation, learning from every volley. When the drones found that energy shields could be overwhelmed by sheer numbers, they changed tactics and began latching onto the hulls of Terran warships, cutting through armor with molecular edged appendages, trying to breach the interior and convert the crew the way they had converted every other species they had ever encountered. On the cruiser TNS Relentless, 200 drones breached the port hull and began flooding through the corridors, and they ship's captain, a woman named Petra Sokolov, who had fought in 3 colonial border wars and had never once given an order she was not willing to carry out herself, made a decision that would have horrified any conquered commander. She ordered her crew to seal their helmets, then vented every atmosphere in the ship at once. The explosive decompression blew half the drones out into space, and the crew of the Relentless fought the rest in vacuum, boots magnetized to the deck, firing ballistic weapons that did not need air to function, killing the invaders hand to hand in corridors with no gravity and no sound except the vibrations transmitted through their own armor. When the last drone was destroyed, Petra Sokolov repressurized the ship and resumed firing on the swarm without even filing a damage report. On the dreadnought TNS Unbroken, the situation was worse. The Hollow had managed to land a hive node on the hull, a pulsing mass of organic tissue that was converting the ship's outer armor into more drones in real time. And the captain realized that no amount of firepower would remove it before the ship was consumed from the outside in. He ordered the crew to evacuate to the escort frigates, stayed at the helm himself, and drove the Unbroken at full speed into the nearest hollow cluster, a formation of thousands of drones surrounding a command node, and detonated the ship's antimatter reactor. At point-blank range, the explosion erased everything within 100 km and left a gap in the swarm that the Armada poured through like water through a broken dam. This was what the Hollow had never encountered before, a species that treated its own ships as weapons, that adapted faster than the swarm could learn, that responded to every loss not with retreat but with a ferocity that bordered on something the Hollow's intelligence could not classify or predict. The Armada pushed deeper into the expanse, burning a corridor through the swarm toward the Valkyrie homeworld, and the cost was terrible. 1,200 human ships destroyed in the first 48 hours, tens of thousands of lives lost in battles that lasted minutes and consumed everything in them. But the advance did not stop, not for 1 second, not for 1 moment, because every crew in the fleet knew what was waiting at the end of that corridor. 2 billion Valkyrie civilians trapped beneath a planetary shield that was failing by the hour, people who had been waiting for rescue that the rest of the galaxy had decided was not worth the risk. When the Armada finally broke through to the Valkyrie homeworld, the shield was down to 40% power, and the Hollow was hours away from breaking through and consuming every living thing on the surface. Terran Marines deployed by the thousands, dropping from orbit in armored pods that punched through the Hollow's aerial drones like bullets. through paper, establishing a perimeter around the shield generators and holding it with a savagery that stunned the Valkyrie defenders who had been fighting alone for weeks. A Valkyrie commander, a tall being with silver skin and eyes like deep water, who had lost her flagship and most of her fleet in the first days of the invasion, was pulled from the wreckage of a crashed transport by a squad of human Marines who had fought through 3 km of hollow-infested terrain to reach her. She looked at the humans in their scarred and dented armor, at their faces behind cracked visors, and she asked, through a translator that crackled with static and exhaustion, "Why did you come? You do not know us. You owe us nothing. Your conquered seat does not require this." The Marine sergeant who had carried her out of the wreckage on his back was reloading his weapon, and he looked at her with eyes that were tired and bloodshot and completely without hesitation. "Didn't need to know you," he said. "Simply, you needed help." She stared at him, and for the first time in weeks, something other than despair moved behind her silver eyes. Deep in the expanse, beyond the Valkyrie system, the Armada's long-range sensors detected something massive. A structure the size of a moon orbiting a dying red star, pulsing with energy signatures that matched the command frequency of every hollow drone in existence. The core, the brain of the swarm, the heart of the hollow, the thing that turned mindless parasites into a coordinated extinction. Vasek studied the sensor data on his command screen, and he knew with absolute certainty that the war would not end until that thing was dead, and he knew with equal certainty what killing it would cost. He opened a channel to the fleet. "All ships, new heading, we are going for the core, and we are not stopping until it is dust." The Armada turned toward the dying red star, and the hollow screamed in frequencies that shook the fabric of space itself, because for the first time in its ancient and terrible existence, something was coming for it that was not afraid. The hollow core hung in the darkness like a wound in the universe. Moon-sized mass of stolen ships and consumed worlds and living tissue fused together into something that pulsed with a cold and terrible intelligence, orbiting a dying red star that bathed everything in light the color of old blood. Commander Vasek stood on the bridge of the Defiance and stared at it through the viewport, and for just a moment, one single heartbeat, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he was looking at. This was the thing that had eaten civilizations older than the stars, that had crossed the void between galaxies to feed, that had turned 300 species into raw material, and would do the same to every living thing in the Milky Way if it was not stopped here in this place by the battered and bleeding fleet that had punched its way through hell to reach it. "All ships, this is Vasek," he said into the fleet channel, and every surviving captain in the Armada heard his voice in their ears, steady as a heartbeat. "We have reached the core. What happens in the next few hours decides whether this galaxy lives or dies, and I will not insult you by pretending the odds are in our favor." He paused, and when he spoke again, there was something in his voice that was not courage exactly, but something deeper, something that lived in the part of the human spirit that had crawled out of the ocean and stood upright and looked at the stars and said, "Yes, we will go there too." Split into 3 groups, Wolf Pack takes the left flank, Iron Line takes the right, and Spearhead comes with me. Straight up the middle, we pin the swarm. On the sides and punch through to the core's shell, and then we kill it. The Armada split like a river dividing around a stone, and the hollow responded with everything it had. Trillions of drones erupted from the core's surface in a swarm so dense that sensor arrays couldn't distinguish individual targets. It was like flying into a living ocean, a wall of gnashing metal and converted flesh that hit the Armada from every direction at once. Wolfpack and Iron Line engaged the flanks in a battle that stretched across millions of kilometers, frigates darting through drone clouds and detonating cluster charges that cleared space for the cruisers behind them. Dreadnoughts absorbing wave after wave of impacts that cratered their armor and peeled away hull plating like skin from bone. And through the center, Spearhead drove forward, the Defiance at its tip, surrounded by the heaviest ships in the fleet, every gun firing, every shield burning white with overload, pushing through the swarm toward the core with the unstoppable momentum of a species that had decided the word retreat did not apply today. Then in the chaos of battle, something changed on the sensor screens. New hyperspace signatures, dozens of them, appearing on the edge of the combat zone. For one terrible moment, Vasek thought the hollow had reinforcements, and then the communication officer shouted something that made every human on the bridge turn their heads. "Commander, those are conquered signatures, the Drenari, the Lethani, the Orvani, they are hailing us." The first ship to drop out of hyperspace was a Drenari scout wing, 12 small vessels barely armed, clearly terrified but here, followed by a Lethani battle group of 40 warships that immediately opened fire on the nearest drone cluster without waiting for orders. Then more came, Valkyrie survivors who had rallied what remained of their shattered fleet, Torvani heavy cruisers, painted in mourning colors, Selenith carriers, ships launching fighters that sparkled like silver dust in the red starlight, and more kept coming, species that Vasek had never heard of dropping out of hyperspace and announcing their presence on open channels with voices that shook with fear but did not waver. On Ithara Prime, Admiral Rhea Marin was the reason. She had spent the last 72 hours in the Conqueror's communication center, refusing to sleep, refusing to eat, doing something that no human had ever done before, commanding alien fleets by sheer force of will and improvisation, calling in every favor, every debt, every shred of goodwill that humanity had earned in its 40 years as a Conqueror member. She had shamed the Drenari by broadcasting footage of human ships dying to protect Valkyrie civilians, while Drenari fleets sat safe behind their borders, and she had challenged the Lethani honor code by asking publicly whether their ancestors would approve of hiding while younger species bled, and she had simply begged the rest openly, without pride, without pretense, because sometimes the most powerful weapon in the universe is a voice that says please. And they came, not all of them, not even most of them, but enough to tell the galaxy that humanity did not fight alone, even if humanity had been willing to. The Conqueror reinforcements were disorganized, their tactics incompatible with each other and with human doctrine, their ships slower and more cautious than the Terran warships that had been fighting for days, but they fought and they died alongside humans in the fire of the swarm, and that mattered more than any tactical advantage ever could. Vasic's spearhead finally reached the core's outer shell, a wall of fused metal and organic tissue kilometers thick, and the dreadnoughts opened fire with their siege cannons, blasting craters in the surface that revealed a nightmare interior of pools and corridors and shifting geometry that seemed to breathe. All spearhead ships, we are going inside, Vasic ordered, and he heard the sharp intake of breath from his bridge crew, and he did not blame them. The ships that followed the Defiance into the core's interior entered a world that defied everything they knew about space combat. The corridors shifted and sealed behind them, trapping ships in pockets of crushing pressure, and the core's own immune system attacked them with tendrils of living metal that wrapped around hulls and tried to digest them. The fighting inside the core was close and savage and desperate, ships firing at point-blank range into walls that regenerated almost as fast as they were destroyed, crews boarding and fighting through organic tunnels with cutting torches and explosives, marine squads disappearing into passages that closed like throats and never opening again. Half of Vasic's assault group was destroyed in the first hour inside the core, ships crushed, consumed, or simply lost in the maze of shifting corridors. And the survivors pushed on because there was no going back, because the corridors behind them had already sealed, because the only way out was through. The Defiance took hit after hit, losing sections of the ship one by one, the port engine array torn away by a tendril the size of a skyscraper, the lower decks breached and flooded with organic matter that the crew fought back with fire and fury. But the ship kept moving, kept driving forward until its sensors finally detected what they had come to find. The neural center, a chamber at the heart of the core where the swarm intelligence lived, a pulsing mass of light and tissue and stolen consciousness that coordinated every drone, every attack, every consumed world in the Hollow's domain. The Defiance broke through into the chamber, and the core screamed, a sound that was not sound, a pulse of electromagnetic agony that knocked out systems across the entire fleet and made every living being within 1,000 kilometers feel a moment of pure, overwhelming terror. The ship was crippled, engines dead, weapons offline except for the antimatter warheads that sat in there, launch tubes like sleeping dragons, and Vasic stood on a bridge that was half destroyed, bleeding from a gash above his eye, and he knew. He had always known, somewhere in the part of himself that had answered the call on Kepler 22b, without hesitation, that this was where the road ended. All hands abandon ship, he said, and his voice was calm in a way that made his crew stop and look at him, because they understood what calm like that meant. Get to the escape pods, I am finishing this. They argued, some of them, and others simply saluted with tears cutting tracks through the grime and blood on their faces, and one by one they left until Vasic stood alone on the bridge of the Defiance with his hands on the weapons console and the neural center of the Hollow filling his viewport like a second sun. He opened a channel not just to the Armada, not just to the conquered reinforcements, but to every receiver in range, every species, every soul listening in the galaxy. This is Fleet Commander Aaron Vasic of the Terran Navy, he said, and his voice carried across the stars with the weight of every human who had ever stood alone against the dark. Tell them we were here. He fired every antimatter warhead in the Defiance launched at once, streaking across the chamber in lines of white fire and striking the neural center in a cascade of detonations that tore through the heart of the hollow's intelligence like a fist through glass. The core screamed one last time and then it died. The explosion that followed was beyond anything the galaxy had ever measured. Blast that expanded outward from the core in a sphere of pure energy that vaporized the moon-sized structure from the inside out and kept going. A shockwave racing through the expanse at a speed that turned the dying red stars light white. Across the expanse, across 1,000 contested systems and 100 burning worlds, every holodrone froze in place as if a switch had been thrown. Their movement stopped, their weapons went silent, their connection to the intelligence that had driven them for millennia severed in an instant, and then they began to fall apart, crumbling into dust and dead metal in silence. But the shockwave was still expanding, still racing outward, and the surviving fleet, human and alien alike, battered and broken and running on emergency power, was directly in its path, and it was coming fast. The shockwave hit the surviving fleet like the hand of a god sweeping across the stars, and in the seconds before it reached them, every captain in the Armada made a choice. Some chose to run, burning their last reserves of fuel to angle away from that blast and ride the edge of the expanding sphere like surfers on a wave of fire, their ships groaning and buckling under the stress, hull plates tearing free and spinning into the void, but the cores holding, the frames holding, the crews holding on with white knuckles and clenched teeth, and the absolute refusal to die after everything they had survived. Some chose to shield Terran cruisers and frigates, positioning themselves between the blast in the slower and GT snorts, and GT more fragile conquered vessels that could not outrun the shock wave, absorbing the impact with their own hulls burning from the outside, and so that the ships behind them might live. The captain of the TNS Horizon, a frigate with a crew of 42, placed her ship directly in the path of the blast to protect a Valkyrie medical transport carrying 6,000 wounded civilians, and when the shock wave passed, the horizon was a drifting skeleton of melted metal. But the medical transport was intact, and every soul aboard it was alive. Across the fleet, in those terrible, brilliant minutes, human ships died to save alien ships, and alien ships that could have fled chose instead to stay beside their human allies, and something was forged in that fire that no treaty or diplomatic ceremony could ever have created, not an alliance of convenience, not a political arrangement, but a bond written in sacrifice and sealed in the light of a dying star. When the shock wave finally dissipated and the silence returned, the surviving fleet drifted in a field of debris that stretched for millions of kilometers, and the damage reports that filtered in told a story that would be remembered for as long as the galaxy had memory, of the 14,000 human warships that had entered the expanse. 4,200 survived, battered, broken, many running on backup systems with hulls held together by emergency patches and sheer stubbornness, their crews exhausted beyond the point where exhaustion had meaning. The dreadnought TNS Unbreakable had lost 60% of its mass and was being towed by two frigates that were not in much better shape, and its captain transmitted a status report that consisted of a single word: alive. The conquered reinforcements had fared worse in some ways and better in others. Their ships were more fragile but had been positioned farther from the blast, and the human ships that had shielded them had absorbed the worst of the damage. And as the alien captain surveyed what the Terran fleet had done to protect them, a silence fell across their communication channels that was heavier than any words could have been. On the Valkyrie homeworld, the planetary shield flickered and died, but it did not matter anymore because there was nothing left to defend against. Skies above the planet, which had been darkened for weeks by the swarm, were clear for the first time since the invasion began, and when the 2 billion Valkyrie who had sheltered beneath the shield looked up and saw stars instead of drones, the sound that rose from the surface was not a cheer or a shout, but something closer to a prayer, a low harmonic vibration that their species produced instinctively in moments of overwhelming emotion. A sound that meant we are still here, we are still here, we are still here. Across the expanse, the hollow's remnants crumbled, drones dissolving into inert dust, hive nodes collapsing under their own weight, the organic structures that had consumed worlds withering and dying like plants cut off from their roots, and 300 species who had been hours or days from extinction stepped out of their shelters and bunkers and hiding places and looked up at skies that were free. The messages began within hours. They came from every corner of the conquered, from species that had sent ships and species that had not, from civilizations that had mocked humanity, and civilizations that had never heard of Earth until the Armada crossed their sensor range. Transmitted in every language and format the galaxy possessed, all carrying the same meaning. Thank you. The Drenari High Speaker, the same being who had told Ryam Aaron that humanity needed another 1,000 years to mature, sent a personal transmission to the Terran embassy that contained no words, only the Drenari gesture of deepest respect. All 4 eyes closed simultaneously, held for 10 seconds, a gesture that had not been offered to another species in over 12,000 years. The Valkyrie commander who had been rescued by human marines, the silver-skinned woman who had asked why they came, broadcast a message to her entire species that was picked up and rebroadcast across the galaxy. They came because we called, they stayed because we needed them, and they bled because that is what humans do. They hear pain and they answer it, and they do not stop until the pain is gone. On Ethera Prime, the conquered reconvened in the Hall of Voices, and for the first time in the history of that ancient chamber, every seat was filled and every voice was silent. Admiral Ryam Aaron walked to the podium, not the small one at the back where humanity's delegation had always been seated, but the central podium, the one reserved for the security chorus, the one she had been denied 3 times, and no one stopped her, no one objected, no one so much as raised a whisper of protest. The vote to grant humanity a permanent seat on the security chorus was unanimous, and it was over in less time than it had taken to deny the request the first time. And when Rhea sat down in the chair that had been waiting for her species for 40 years, she did not smile or celebrate or make a speech. She simply closed her eyes for a moment and thought of Vasek and of the crews who would never come home, and of the words that had crossed the stars like a final heartbeat, tell them we were here. The galaxy built a memorial in the Valkyrie expanse in the space where the core had been around the dead red star that had witnessed the final battle. It was a ring of light-engineered star, fair contained in a gravitational lattice that would burn for 1,000,000 years, and along its inner surface were inscribed the names of every ship and every soul that had fallen in the battle, human and alien alike, written in every known language and characters of plasma that glowed against the dark. At the center of the ring, larger than all the other inscriptions, were the words that Commander Aaron Vazik had spoken before he fired. "Tell them we were here," and beneath them the name of his ship, the TNS Defiance, burning in light that could be seen from 100 light years away. Pilgrims came from across the galaxy to see it, not just Valkyrie, not just humans, but species from every arm of the Milky Way, civilizations that had existed for ages beyond counting, making the journey to stand before the memorial and remember the day that a young and reckless species from a small blue world on the galactic fringe had done what no one else would do. Years passed and the galaxy healed and the expanse was rebuilt, and new alliances were formed that would have been unthinkable before the war. But the memory did not fade, because some things are too large and too important to be forgotten, and what humanity had done in the Valkyrie expanse was one of those things. On Earth, in a schoolyard in a city that had not changed much in the centuries since humans first looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there, young girl sat on a bench during recess and stared at the sky. It was daytime and the stars were not visible, but she knew where they were. Her teacher had shown her a map of the galaxy just that morning, had pointed out the Valkyrie expanse and told the class what had happened there, had shown them images of the memorial ring burning in the dark. The girl's name was Lena, and she was 7 years old, and she had a question that had been sitting in her chest all day, like a stone. When her teacher came to sit beside her, she asked it, "Will we have to do it again? Will someone else need help someday?" Her teacher looked at her for a long moment and then smiled in a way that was both sad and warm, the way adults smile when children ask questions that deserve honest answers. "Someday, yes, the galaxy is very large, and there will always be someone who needs help. And will we go? We will always go." Lena nodded, satisfied in the way that children are satisfied when they receive an answer that matches what they already believed, and she went back to looking at the sky with eyes that held no fear, only the quiet certainty of a species that had written its answer to the universe in fire and sacrifice and stubborn, unbreakable love. The galaxy had screamed for help, and from the edge of the stars, from a world of water and fire and stubborn, reckless, beautiful fury, humanity had answered, not because it was asked politely, not because it was politically convenient, not because there was anything to gain, but because that was what humans did, had always done. And GT,